Welcome to Lift Your Legacy. My name is Jacob Prupp, father, husband, and rabbi. And each week we bring you an inspiring person or message to help you unlock your inner potential and create change that will impact the future. Thank you for listening, and let's get to it.
So what if I told you there were some really deep questions in Judaism and maybe people don't know what the answers are? A lot of times as a professional outreach individual, we come across as if we know all the answers, and we don't, frankly. And that's okay because we might never have. And there is a phenomenal new book called Judaism Reclaimed, Philosophy and Theology in the Torah, by a young scholar named Shmuel Phillips. And he dives into all of those difficult questions that so many people might not know the answers to in his new book. And I'm thrilled to have him on the show today. And we discuss not only some of the issues that he has encountered, but what it's like writing a book and the reception the book received, and why do we have such big questions in Judaism and potentially don't try to answer them. So no further ado, Shmuel Phillips. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, Lift Your Legacy is committed to helping you live a more authentic and meaningful life. That being said, if I could ask you to share this podcast with someone that you think would get value from the message, that would be fantastic. In addition, I wanted to make you aware that along with the podcast, I do offer executive coaching. I help people who are successful and highly motivated, who want to see extreme, or not even so extreme, maybe just a small change that in their life. I want to help them get to the next level. What does that mean specifically? Creating more peace in your relationships with yourself, growing your business, clarifying your career. And even if you need a little bit of help losing some weight or getting more healthy, I do that also. I'm not for everyone, but for those people that are invested in making their life better and taking the next step, I highly recommend you consider me as a coach for you. Now, how do you get in touch? Well, you found the podcast. I wanted to tell you also my email, Jacob, my first name, jacob@liftyourlegacy.live. Feel free, please, to reach out there or on any or all of my social media channels. I'd be thrilled to give you a complimentary half-an-hour conversation to see if we might be a good fit to work together. And now, with no further ado, I ask you to please sit back and enjoy the show. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm thrilled to have on today Shmuel Phillips, Rabbi Shmuel Phillips, who wrote one of the most compelling books I've read recently in the Jewish new releases. It's called Judaism Reclaimed. For those of you watching the video, here is the cover. And what's really exciting about this new book is that it takes a lot of the modern issues that we struggle with as Jews, and it puts it in the context not only of like the weekly Torah portion, but utilizes an extremely broad approach of explaining things so that they make sense, which as a Jew, we always try to make things make sense. So that's great. So I'm thrilled to have the author on today, Shmuel Phillips. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Thank you for your kind words, your introduction. Pleased you're enjoying the book.
So tell me a little bit, why now? Why did you write the book? What were you trying to fill in the marketplace when you underwent what I imagine was probably a very laborious study routine to find all the sources and put it all together?
Well, it's interesting you talk about a laborious study routine. It wasn't just one morning I woke up and said, I'm going to write this really long book about Jewish philosophy, theology. It's not something I ever would have thought of myself doing. I must be 5-6 years ago. I've been in yeshiva in Yerushalayim for on and off about 18 years. I've been studying and working part-time during that period. But I've become friendly with many people who passed through the yeshiva world and are now studying, now working elsewhere in the States, in England, and having kept in contact with these people. And discussing their religious issues that are coming up and which sort of questions are confronting them, and how, in many respects, the preparation they had, the things they studied in yeshiva, didn't really prepare them for everything they came up against in the outside world. So I started writing a short weekly idea related somewhat to the parasha, which often, as you see the chapters in the book, often moves away from the parasha into a separate discussion point. And I started circulating it to my friends, to family, and it grew over a year or so. And by the end of the year, people said to me, "This is really great, you've got to put it together, publish it." And I said, "Well, that's not something I ever had myself in for." But I sat down, I started doing more research one by one on each of the chapters, and circulating these chapters, and gradually people were coming back to me saying, "Yeah, there's a real need for this." Because on the one hand, on the very academic level, there's material out there for people who are studying this on a university level, and taking 3-4 years out of their life to really get a very clear understanding of these issues. But for most people, they don't have the time, the resources to spend on this. Yet these are questions that really bother them, interest them. So on the one hand, you've got the university people and the material, which is really on a quite complex for standard people. And on the other hand, you've got the more standard Orthodox approach, which tends to shy away from these questions. We don't like to ask difficult questions which make us feel uncomfortable. And therefore, very often, the sort of books, the sort of resources you turn to for other questions in Judaism, you don't find necessarily such satisfactory answers for questions about, let's say, commonality between the ancient texts of Hammurabi and the Torah, or questions of people that try and use the Torah's texts and repetitions and various idiosyncrasies to suggest multiple authorship. You don't find people really dealing with that on anything less than an academic level, which is not really so easily understood and coped with by people at the standard readership level, standard yeshiva level.
So talk to me a little bit about that risk potentially of why ignore or not ask the big questions, which lead a person who might have that university background or a deeper psychology or philosophic background a little bit bereft. And I mean, frankly, it's like you have questions. Most of the English books are not going to cover it. And while they might be handled by, the Rav Hirsch or a variety of the other classic Jewish philosophers, for the average person, it's like they're not going to get it. So like, why do you feel that there has been such a desire to sort of move away from in-depth, frankly, pretty difficult questions that challenge us as people that feel that the text and the whole religion is fact and true?
It's a great question. I'm pleased you asked that. The first chapter, really the introduction of my book, I have a look at this idea on the basis of a dispute between Rambam, Maimonides, and the Rayavad. They're talking about 1,000 years ago about the very difficult question of God's knowledge. On one hand, God knows everything. On the other hand, we believe we have free will. And you find Rambam writing on and on, going back and forth, trying to understand, trying to resolve this conundrum. If God knows what I'm going to do, how do I have free will? And again, it goes back and forth over a whole long page in Mishnah Torah and Hilchot Shuvah. And he ends up saying, you know what, we can understand to a certain extent, but we have to accept that God's knowledge is something which transcends our understanding. It's not what we call knowledge. And in the end, we have to be able to accept that, yes, God has knowledge of what we're going to do, and we still have free will, and we have to accept that there are some things that we cannot resolve. And Rambam attacks Rambam for his whole approach here. He says, this isn't the way of our sages. If there's a problem that we cannot give a simple answer to, we don't even address it. We say it's a matter of simple faith. So we see within Jewish tradition very different ways of approaching this sort of question. Rambam finds value in probing the limits of our understanding and trying to work out what we can understand, what we can't understand, try to find answers, even less convincing answers for as many things as we can. Whereas for people like Uriah, if it's not something which we can find a simple answer to, that's not really our job. We go on, we keep the Torah, we keep the mitzvot, we do what we can understand, and we have faith that there are answers out there. So I start off showing that are these two legitimate paths in the Jewish tradition. But then the question is where that leads us nowadays. Because in today's world, it's very hard to say, well, you know what, I'm going to live in my own little shtet, or my own little world, my secluded world. And I know there are questions out there, but I'm not going to deal with those. I'm going to go on with studying my Torah portion, going and doing the mitzvot. And I'm not going to worry about it, because in today's world, with the internet, with blogs, with social media, university campuses, these questions come out and confront you. And already in the 1960s, which is well before the internet era, the information era, we have someone like Rabbi Shmuel, who is a rabbinic leader in America, coming and saying that in today's generation, this question isn't a question anymore. We need to implement some kind of Torah and Derech Eretz education to beat these rebellious ideas back into submission. Meaning that even though, yes, in Jewish tradition we have both approaches being legitimate, people who want to focus more on the performance of mitzvahs and leave these questions aside, today's generation in which these questions confront us is more of an obligation, as the Mishnah says in Avot, we have to prepare ourselves to know what to respond to the heretic.
So, you know, based on what you're saying, it's interesting because this was in the 60s, and then you had the whole, you know, there's different epochs of it. And it's interesting because, you know, in your book, for example, you know, you could have, I mean, that's just one of the beautiful ideas of Jewish learning in general, is you'll have a, you know, multi, 1,000-year gap, and, you know, someone from across the world arguing with somebody else who from a timeline never met each other, and, you know, but are still able to have a conversation. What's interesting is, as we slow time down in the modern sense, it does seem as if the majority of the Jewish world, the Orthodox world, has sort of shied away from these kinds of discussions. And I'm curious if in your studies, are you aware if this is sort of a new thing, or is this something that has been kind of going through time? And another reason why I want to ask is because, you know, we live in a time where, you know, let's say for the last 30 years, outreach, you know, Kiruv outreach has been a major thing. And so there are rabbis who are schooled in Talmud and Torah and the Parsha going out and speaking to, you know, I hate calling them secular Jews, but Jews who are growing up not as literate in their traditional sources, but awash in the world of the modern world, and trying to suggest in a lot of ways that Judaism has all of the big answers figured out. But when you read your book, you realize that that's not necessarily true. And all those big answers, there are all kinds of rabbis that argued on those big answers in terms of what there was. So is that a peril you found as you wrote this kind of a book, to make people realize, like, oh, hey, wait a minute, it's not as simple as it looks?
Well, on the one hand, and you talk about the fact that the Orthodox reaction to modernity in the internet era is still very much in flux. And I think that's true, because we still have segments of the Orthodox community which is trying to pull back further and further into seclusion, try to pull back further and further behind the ghetto walls, which are slowly crumbling and falling down. And it's getting harder and harder to live that life of seclusion. There's a debate going on right now on the Cross Currents Orthodox. This is crosscurrents.com, a forum of Orthodox rabbis talking about this very question: how do we respond to forms of biblical criticism where we don't really have the Gedolei Torah in our generation, as we did in previous generations, addressing these situations? We had Rav Shimshon Hirsch, who was a Torah giant back in the 1800s. We had people like Malbim. We had, you know, obviously Rambam Maimonides in his era. These are Torah giants who stood up and addressed the question. So it's very much an issue in flux at the moment, because we're always a stage behind. We have the modern era pushes forward, and it takes a good 10, 20, 30 years for Orthodoxy to find its feet and find the correct reaction or range of reactions to this phenomenon. So, the other part of your question?
Well, I mean that takes us down another fantastic rabbit hole, which is very interesting. Is that like you said, that Orthodoxy, it's like there was a period of many years before Rav Hirsch came in which Reform had essentially kind of cornered the market on quote modern philosophy, and it took decades for Rav Hirsch to come out that said, I know all the stuff that you've read. I can write in the same high-level German that you can, and I also know the sources that you don't know, which is the traditional Jewish sources, and this is how it makes sense, and this is how you misunderstood it, and a person doesn't necessarily have to sacrifice their religious identity or their belief in God or the truth of the Torah in order to be able to make peace between, modern scientific theory and the Bible, so to speak. But what's interesting is in the modern day, the time has sped up so rapidly that 10 years, which was not much time back in the day, 10 years is like iPhone wasn't around. And it's like the world has changed, and it is a big risk. The interesting thing I'm thinking as you were speaking is it's like, we don't have the big rabbis, so to speak, anymore who necessarily have, again, you have Rav Lopiansky and you have people who are versed in at least, the more modern psychology, philosophers and historians, and are able, Rabbi Gottlieb, people like that. But the challenge over there is that the people who are going to listen to Rabbi Gottlieb or Rabbi Lopiansky are already more or less, in my mind, Orthodox. And the Jews that are out on the front lines that are looking for these kinds of answers, they're not going to go sit and listen to someone that's going to do a presentation of their level. And that's a general gap that I've noticed and I've identified, and I've yelled and screamed about to anybody that listens. Now it's you because you're on the other end of the phone. But it's like, yes, maybe Rabbi Gottlieb has the answer, but the college student I'm talking to is not going to listen to Rabbi Gottlieb because, like, why would he go listen to this man with a beard that lives in Jerusalem? It's like not interesting for him. And back in the old days, the quote unquote glory days of Kiruv, there was like people were questioning, but like nowadays people don't really question that much until they're sort of like taught to question. It's not like a expected thing. So my question would be for you, is there a certain peril or fear that you just kind of stepped up and did it, in the sense that, nowadays you don't have to go to, I don't know, I wanted to try a new cocktail last night. And so I didn't go to bartending school. I went on YouTube. I found some dude that did it and it worked out great. And it's like, there's been a mass democratization of knowledge nowadays with technology. So I'm curious, like, the Gedolim haven't done the book that you wrote. You did it. Is that scary for you? Or is it just kind of like celebrating the era that we're in?
Well, I don't think of it really as an alternative to what the Gedolim are doing. One of the things that I found really fascinating, you talk about Rav Hirsch and his era really addressing the challenges of Reform Judaism. Obviously, Rambam did it in his era in terms of the Greek philosophy that was about. But when you look into the basic underpinnings of these questions, very often it's the same issue, the same challenge, just coming back in different form. And a number of my chapters, for example, on how the oral law works and whether it can be kept up to date or not, various things like that, I've taken the basic answer that Rav Hirsch has given 150 years ago, and I just repackaged it in modern form. And I've been quite open about it. I've posted all the sources. But very often the same challenge that modernity threw down to Orthodox Judaism in the 1800s, or even in Rambam's time, is coming back in a different form in today's era. So combining the likes of Rav Hirsch, the Malbim, the Rambam, the Tziv, whose writings we have, the big Gedolei Torah, we do have many Orthodox thinkers who are not sure we'd call great Rabbanim, but they are Orthodox thinkers and they are academically accepted. So what I've really tried to do is combine these two in the area of academic criticism of the Torah. We have people like Rabbi Joshua Berman, who's an accepted academic scholar who's writing books for academics in the non-Jewish world. So taking his details and joining them up, combining them with the general approaches of people like Hirsch and the Rambam, I found it to be a very potent cocktail. And you talk about the democratization of knowledge and the things which are available online. And that's something which I am really trying to do now. I'm putting my information up on Facebook. I'm growing a group here. I'm trying to disseminate some of the answers to make it available, both to people who are working in Kirov and to just general people who are interested, looking for answers. Because I do think that people all have moments in their life where they do look for answers. The question is, can they find you?
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things that I found really fascinating in one of the earlier chapters of your book was that whenever a rabbi would come along, I mean, you spent a lot of time talking about the Rambam and the Ralbag, I think it was, that was arguing with him, but like, you know, it's so fascinating that you would have someone that would come out and sort of champion this cause of making Judaism relatable in the language of what Jews are studying. And rather than everybody falling all over themselves being, you know, like, thank God he came along and did it, you find a lot of rabbis being like, you can't listen to this guy and you have to burn all of his stuff. And I'm curious, as someone that sort of stepped out in the world and identified yourself as, okay, I'm going to write a book like this, and, you know, and should, did you find that you had any kind of negative pushback at all from various corners of the Jewish world?
It's an interesting question, because I had prepared myself for some kind of pushback in this way, and I marketed the book pretty widely, both in the Haredi world and the modern Orthodox world, and even in the non or less religious world. And I've really been fascinated by the fact that within each set, obviously there've been, not everyone who's responded has loved the book, but in general there's been a warm reception in every segment that Orthodox are coming along saying, you know, these are really interesting questions which I always had and I put away. The Orthodox, the more Haredi people are often saying, these are questions which I often had, and you know, I didn't know they were legitimate questions to ask, or I just didn't know how to deal with them. I didn't find any source in with them, so I filed them away, but they're always troubling me. And then obviously the people who were aware of these questions but hadn't found any of the existing material really satisfactory, or didn't summarize it in a way which they could really relate to, didn't show the entire range of approaches. So I have been surprised by how warm the response has been across the entire range of the entire spectrum of both Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews.
What do you attribute that to? I'm sure, I mean, it's a great book and you wrote it well. Do you attribute that? I'm so curious, like, to what do you attribute that to, that there's not a pushback? Is it just that people are less attached right now? People see a bigger value of it? I mean, for me, it's just so interesting that, you know, we could have, and again, I don't know if this is a reaction, if this is on purpose, but it's like, you know, for those that are not familiar, you know, you could have someone sit down and spend, if you wanted to do it well, you know, hours and days and years on like a single page of Talmud or a single line in the Chumash, and like nothing is taken for granted, and you could change the smallest thing and it causes another 400 pages of text, and you put this here, and it's like there's such a profound amount of specificity and care taken to dissect certain texts. But then when it comes down to a big thing like, does God care about what you do, or does God know what you're going to do? Suddenly most people look around, they're like, oh, I just didn't know I was supposed to ask that question, or I didn't know I could ask that question. So what do you have any perspective on that dichotomy and why it does exist within the Orthodox world?
Well, it could be, it goes back to what we discussed, you know, a few minutes ago about the Rambam and the Raivad. I think definitely within the Haredi world, the opinion of the Raivad has really become more acceptable over the years. The fact that these various things that we have to believe we call them principles of faith, that God, the whole Torah comes from Sinai, and God knows what we're doing, and the rewards and punishments, Olam Haba, Mashiach. And we're not supposed to look further in. We don't necessarily understand all the details of it, but these are things which we have received through the tradition, and we're not supposed to question them. And for many years, probably for centuries, that is the opinion which has become accepted.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so on the flip side, I was curious. Now that you've done so much research and know all of these, different approaches for different answers, how has that affected your Judaism and how you look at various big questions within Jewish faith?
That's interesting from a personal perspective. I'll give you a little bit of an introduction. When I was born, my parents were in the process of becoming religious. So I was born into a newly religious family. And on the one hand, it was exhilarating because everything was new, everything was exciting. Every time Shabbat, Chag came around, there was this fire, this excitement, this energy. On the other hand, there were lots of questions, not just from my parents who were discovering and understanding everything and trying out different shuls and schools, and a lot of it was unsettling, but also from the wider family, like the grandparents who felt rejected and were constantly questioning us. Why are you doing this? What's the meaning of it? What's the meaning of that? This is contradictory. This is immoral. So I grew up with this idea of being able to justify everything that I was doing. So growing up and studying a broader range of sources, I found that I had the questions already, and I was constantly asking myself these questions. It just broadened my own framework of how to deal with them.
And as a result, now doing all the work, has it changed at all, or is it just kind of you feel like more versed in the different opinions?
Well, I do rethink these questions, and some days I'll read through my chapters and I'll find them very convincing, and the next day I'll read through it and think it's a bit light. And I'll dig a little bit more and look for a different answer, or look for someone else who's commented on it. So I really find that for Judaism to be dynamic, we have to really live these questions and reapproach them and rethink them constantly. And the way that you'll address various questions of how to relate to God and relate to the Torah when you are 15, 20, 25, 30 is going to be different. And even from one day to the next, or morning to evening. I find, I'll wake up in the morning on my way to Shachrit, and I'm in a bad mood, I'm a bit tired, and it's really tough to sort of convince myself I'm doing something worthwhile. Later in the day, I've come back, I've had a good afternoon, I've learned well with my Chavritah for an hour, and my Judaism on top of the world, and everything goes. So different people, different parts of their life, even different parts of the day. We have to constantly be reevaluating and searching for our best way of connecting to God.
Amazing. Go ahead.
Both on an intellectual level, but also, as I wrote at the beginning of the book, we have to have that experiential, that spiritual relationship with God, that sense that we are connecting to something bigger than ourselves. And there's something bigger than ourselves, God who's up there in the universe, or out there in the universe, however we want to depict it, so that when we are struggling intellectually with a certain challenge, we always have that knowledge, that spiritual side, that dimension to our religion also.
So now that this is out, and it sounds like you're doing some work on the social channels, tell me a little bit more, if you could, about where you see this going in the future. I know this is not I point out to everybody, this is not your full-time gig by any stretch of the imagination. But where do you see this brand, so to speak, this approach that you have labored and have been doing it for many years, where do you want this to go?
So it's an interesting question. I haven't really got any very firm answers. I would love to feel that this is going to make a real change out there in the Jewish world, that Jewish educators, that people in Kiruv, that enough people out there will read this book and be inspired to look into more rational areas they can explore the foundations of the faith more. And that will really, when we look 10 years down the line, we look back at what started this, we can see that this book actually made a difference. But again, every author wants to think their book's going to make a difference. But yeah, I'd like to think that I'll continue looking into these matters. Whether there'll be another book or not, it's too early to tell. But yeah, I would really like to feel that enough, and from the feedback I've got from various rabbis, educators, teachers, I really do feel it's got the potential to make a difference, to change people's approach to this matter, to enrich enough people's understanding of the Torah, approaches to difficult questions of Jewish philosophy and theology, to really make some kind of difference.
Brilliant. Okay, Shmuel, how do people find out more about you, find out more about the book, etc.?
So my website is www.judaismreclaimed.com. There you find links everywhere to more information about the book, sample chapters of the book, links to the discussion on the Facebook page, and of course how to buy the book too.
Outstanding. Okay, thank you so much for your time.
Delighted to, it's got my email address up there also. I'm delighted to hear any comments, any feedback, if anyone's seen the book, any questions.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Thank you for having me on the show.
Appreciate it.
There you have it, folks, another inspiring episode. If you enjoyed this, I ask you to please share this with your friends and to like us over on Rabbi Rupp through Facebook or on YouTube. And the more that we're able to get these important messages out, the more that we can really make an impact in the world. So I encourage you, please, to stay tuned. We have a ton of amazing speakers coming up, and also to tell your friends about it. Thank you very much.